Thank you so much, Anastasia, for this kind of presentation. And good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending today's lecture about such a specific topic, but which is very important as the part of Ukraine's-Russia relations, and it's very important concerning of today's event, concerning Russia's invasion, and concerning today's Russia, Europe's energy war, or we could say. Talking in general, the history of Russia-Ukraine energy relations, in a very general case, that's a story of dependence, interdependence, blackmailing, feeding oligarchs and political corruption, sometimes irresponsible or unwise policy, and Ukraine's attempts to weaken this. February 24, the day of Russian invasion, is the date of probably beginning of the end of Russia's energy dominance in Europe and breaking ties, energy ties with Ukraine. And for half a century, Soviet Union, later Russia, were creating and strengthening their energy dominance in Europe. And for decades, Ukraine was a crucial part of all this energy supply and change. During 31 years of independence, Moscow tried to save its control over Ukrainian transit capacities, which were crucial for Russian energy exports, and at the same time, Moscow was trying to decrease its dependency on Ukraine transit, and Ukraine was pathing such a difficult path of its movement towards European integration and decreasing its dependency on Russia. Now Russia is known as the most significant natural gas exporter, and Ukraine is known as a net gas importer. But 60 years ago, the situation was different. In 60s and 70s of the last century, Ukraine was a significant natural gas supplier, and gas from Ukraine was coming to former Soviet Union states. Ukraine was responsible for about a quarter of Soviet Union gas production, so gas was flowing to Moscow, to Minsk, later to Latvia, Estonia, to Moldova, to Czechoslovakia, Austria, Germany, France, Italy, Hungary. So these states, which are today known as huge importers of Russian energies. But later, when colossal oil and gas reserves were found in Siberia, Ukrainian divisions and specialists were moved there to develop these reserves. And in 1878, actually, Siberian gas became a priority, and in Ukraine, gas reserves were not developed. So since late 70s, Ukraine itself became gas dependent, but at that time also the Soviet strategy towards Ukraine in this Soviet European value chain has changed, and Ukraine became a foothold for Soviet energy expansion to Europe and later for this dominance. And even during the period of independence, for 20 years at least, Kremlin was trying to save its control over Ukraine's energy corridor, which was crucial for Russian energy dominance. In terms of gas, Ukraine was the only corridor for the Soviet gas exports to to Europe, and because of two groups of reasons. First of all, it's about location, but the second very important reason was that considering that Ukraine was exporting gas to Soviet republics into Europe, that already was developed gas infrastructure, which was only becoming bigger in terms when gas from Siberia was coming to Europe. Soviet oil came to Europe through Ukraine and Belarus, so most capacities were going through Belarus. Also, huge volumes of coal were going through Ukraine, and later that became an idea that electricity can also be produced in Ukrainian, the time Soviet Republic, cheap electricity, which then later had to be exported to Europe. And so before the Soviet Union collapsed, there were 5 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. And actually, there were idea of construction 5 more. Chernobyl accident has changed these plans, but even after that, and even after Ukraine became independent, Russia still was considering this idea of having Ukraine as a transit state for electricity. And for Russia, this idea from Vladivostok to Lisbon was also a part of idea of energy dominance. So if we briefly check the map, so that is the map of gas pipelines going through Ukraine, through Belarus, through in Russia. So we can see that even gas pipelines going, that is a current map. So that is not the map which was actual 40 years ago, but even the gas pipelines going through Belarus that went to Ukraine and then were going to all European states. So that was because of this gas infrastructure was developed in the period of Ukrainian gas exports. Similar to oil pipelines, so Drusbah oil pipeline was the key the key route, and so northern Drusbah went through Belarus to Poland and Germany, and southern, which is still in use, goes to Slovakia, to Czech Republic, to Hungary, and these, by the way, so European oil embargo prescribes a waiver for these pipelines. So oil still in the next couple of years probably will continue going through Ukraine to these European states. In 1981, that was the first changing moment, so dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the problem was that in a single day, that was an immediate transition to a new economic reality. That was no more a common economy. And so there were broken value-added change which existed inside the Soviet Union. And at the same time, there was no immediate change in human minds, and there was no immediate understanding that since that day, since August 1991, there was a new economic reality, that energy was coming through another state, from Russia, that it will be necessary to pay for this energy market prices. Very soon, Russia started using this leverage. So there was a problem of paternalism and populism, which I suppose to be a very serious factors for Ukraine's energy during the 31 years of independence, various important factors for Russia-Ukraine relations, because paternalism was a part of, it was a basic thing of Soviet citizens' worldview, because people didn't have to care about many things. They were relying on the state, and sure that this worldview couldn't be changed in a single day. And later, because of this paternalism, politicians started promoting populistic theses, which actually were very bad for the economy and for the energy and international energy relations in general. But I will tell a little more later about these factors. So as there was no understanding of new economic reality, immediately from 1981, gas debts were collecting and payments for imported gas. And the very first result of this was in 1983, when there was a conference held in Massandra city in Crimea. And this meeting, during this meeting, parties had to discuss the division of Black Sea Fleet and division of nuclear weapons. So Russia insisted so that gas debts problem was discussed before. And actually, gas debts impacted on the way how the Black Sea Fleet was divided. So Ukraine got much less of ships, of weapons than expected. just because of these gas debts. And also there was a deal, made a deal of nuclear fuel supplies, because so having 5 nuclear power plants, this nuclear fuel was produced in Russia, so they made deal about this. But still, even after the Massandra Accords, the problem of gas unpayments wasn't solved. And in 1885, there was the first cut off of gas supplies. And however, considering that Ukraine was the only transit state, European states were very concerned, and they helped to solve this crisis quickly. But Russia demanded to transfer different assets as a payment for this gas. And that was not only about gas infrastructure, that was about metallurgical companies, chemical companies. So in general, 15 big companies, but so Ukraine didn't do this. And at final extent, these debts were transferred to some obligations, which, however, even then, that time were not paid. And also economic crisis impacted on energy, because of this economic crisis, there was very low demand for energy, and this defined a very low efficiency of energy assets usage. And these factors simplified acquisition of control over these assets. By that moment, we could call them early oligarchs. Most of them are not in force today. And so many of these oligarchs, early oligarchs, were doing business, including business with Russia. Closer to 1986, the crisis has weakened, and so closer to 2000, government managed to solve the problem of this, not at all, but mostly managed to solve the problem of non-payments. And all these barter schemes in energy trade were abandoned. However, non-transparent private companies still played a key role of gas imports to Ukraine from Russia. Despite the fact that Ukraine has the second biggest gas reserves in Europe, since 1981, Ukraine has always been an import-dependent state. For many years, this gas came from Russia. So at the same time, there was privatization, there was a quick privatization of energy assets. And in the late 90s, Ukraine paid previous debts, gas debts, with missiles and armored aircrafts. And even a couple of months ago, there was a discussion if these cruising missiles attacking now Ukraine, whether these that during Kuchma presidency were transferred to Russia. At the same time, in 1986, Yamal-Europe pipeline was constructed, the first pipeline bypassing Ukraine, going through Belarus to Poland, and through Poland to the border with Germany. And the capacity was 33 billion cubic meters. There was about 20% of Russia's export to Europe, except of former Soviet Union states. So this was decreasing the role partly, but that was the beginning of decrease of the role of Ukrainian gas transit and this kind of interdependence between Kiev and Russia. At the same time, a very interesting story of oil and Ukraine-Russia dependence and interdependence on oil. In the very early periods of independence, there were 6 big refineries in Ukraine, and refinery production was about 50 million tons. And the problem was that Ukraine didn't have oil, and there was an idea that Russia can buy some of these refineries. So in 1999 and 2000, Russian companies bought 3 of 6 of these. And these were operating. However, these companies were oriented to buying also getting more access to retail market, to buying and building networks of fueling stations. And in 2006, that was made a huge mistake because government made a very bad mistake with taxation, lifting all duties for fuel imports. And that was an attempt to decrease the role of Ukrainian producers. Mostly that was about Privat group owned by oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky. But at final extent, this pushed to the problem that that refineries owned by Russian companies, actually they were decreasing their production because for Russian companies there was more sense to import oil products from their Russian refineries to Ukraine. And at final extent, if in 2004 Ukraine was only 10% dependent on petrol's imports, then last year it was about 77%. Besides, there were some corrupted and oligarchic schemes when oil products came from Belarus, which, as if they were going to Odessa for further export, but in fact, these were sold in Ukraine without paying duties and taxes. So this was another one problem, killing Ukrainian oil industry and making Ukraine more dependent to Russian oil products and to Belarusian, which originally were produced using Russian oil. So at final extent, last year, 74% of diesel consumed in Ukraine came from Russia and Belarus, 40% of petrol, and 50% of automotive gas came from these both countries. And if talking about Kazakhstan in addition, then about 67% of automotive gas came from these three countries. And in the case of Kazakhstan, it's about transit through Russia. So Ukrainian petrol market became extremely dependent on Russia. So the Orange Revolution was another one point of changing the character of Russia-Ukraine energy relations, because Orange Revolution itself was about expressed desire of Ukrainian society to be more closer to Europe and to be less dependent on Russia. Because Viktor Yushchenko, who won that presidential elections, so his vis-a-vis Viktor Yanukovych was pro-Russian, and very soon after the Orange Revolution, there was a new gas crisis, 2005-2006 gas war. So by that moment, a huge part of gas Ukraine received from Turkmenistan, which was transited through Russia. And in late 2004, there was a dispute with Turkmenistan, which wanted to have a little bit higher price. And in mid-2005, President Yushchenko actually expressed an idea about of no sense of so-called trilateral gas transit consortium. So Russia still wanted to have control over Ukrainian gas transit system, and so Russia was looking for some best model to do this, and there was a proposal to establish a consortium which would own or rent the gas transit system. And consortium itself would be co-established by Russia, Ukraine, and Germany. And actually, Ukraine refused from this because if all three parties have the same stakes in the consortium, in that case, Russia and Germany, which were allies in gas deals, could promote the ideas which wouldn't be of interest to Ukraine. After that, Russian Parliament, Russian Duma demanded to have a market prices for former Soviet Union states, and in late 2005, so Russia started demanding higher price, and Ukraine said that according to that intergovernmental agreement, so every year on January 1st, countries had to negotiate on the price. So Russia cut off gas supplies and started blaming Ukraine on gas thefts during this period. Considering that European states were dependent on these supplies, so this helped. These shortages that Europe experienced, this helped to sign a new contract, which was about that Russian and Turkmen gas was mixed. However, that was mostly Turkmen gas, and so considering the Turkmen gas costed $44, Ukraine actually was paying $95. However, Russia wanted to have the price of $230, but so that 5-year deal was signed, and that occurred such an intermediary gas trader company, Ukrenergo, which was established by Gazprom Bank from the one side, and 2 Ukrainian oligarchs. The biggest stake had Ihor Firtash, Ukrainian oligarch, who is now arrested in Vienna for at least 5 years, staying there. And so many considered that this money that Ukrenergo received, these were used to finance like pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine. So as Russia blamed Ukraine on stealing gas, Russia never managed to prove this. And however, Russia was trying to use this argument to promote construction of new pipelines bypassing Ukraine. This was about South Stream, North Streams, and Turk Stream. And this moment of 2005, 2006, that was actually the final moment when Russia made these decisions and started working on constructing these pipelines. Very soon, in 3 years, there was a new gas tension. However, so the previous contract hasn't expired, but this Ukrenergo has unpayments to Gazprom, and Yulia Tymoshenko, Prime Minister, Ukrainian Prime Minister, she wasn't satisfied with this company, and so there was another one very serious dispute, which resulted in 2 weeks of restriction of supplies of gas, which also meant suspension of supplies to Europe, and many European countries experienced shortages during really cold winter. And this resulted in signing a new 10-year contract with Russia. However, conditions of the contract were not very good, and these became a ground for future disputes with Russia. So the contract abandoned Ukrenergo. The contract was direct between Naftogaz and Gazprom. Earlier, there were like intergovernmental agreements. Gas prices were tied to oil indicators, and the problem was that there was a period of high oil price, and that was also take-or-pay rule that Ukraine had to pay for gas for some specific volume of gas, even if Ukraine didn't consume this gas. So Russian Gazprom became a monopoly supplier. Gazprom didn't want this gas if Ukraine would take gas under take-or-pay rule, so that Gazprom didn't want this gas to be re-exported to Europe, for example. So at final extent, this contract made a ground for further arbitration, and Yulia Tymoshenko was arrested. Actually, she was blamed for signing bad contracts, so the next interesting developments were during Viktor Yanukovych presidency. So in some cases, he took steps which could be treated as intention to to move towards the European Union and European rules. So in 2010, Ukraine joined European Energy Community, but actually there was a very weak progress in reforms. So Ukraine was preparing some legislative changes because the key idea of energy community that all member countries have the same regulations just to create the single energy environment. And in 2010, so prices were very high. And again, there was an issue of Crimea, signing of Kharkiv Pact, which was about prolongation of Russian fleet location in Crimea from 2017 till 2042. And this also stipulated a 30% discount for gas or $100, so depending on the price. And so naturally, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, they canceled this Kharkiv Pact, which means cancellation of this discount. And at the same time, during Yanukovych period, there was a period of rising energy oligarchs close to Yanukovych. So the most prominent was the biggest Ukrainian oligarch, Akhmetov. And that time, young oligarch Kurchenko, who also left to Russia together with Yanukovych. But Kurchenko, staying in Russia, still tried to play the game in Ukrainian energy market. So that was about coal trade, oil trading, and Kurchenko was owner of Odessa refinery. However, so these assets were arrested later. And in 2011, Nord Stream, the pipeline Nord Stream going under the Baltic Sea was put into operation. So 55 BCM of installed capacity, which was about less than half volumes that Ukraine, that was about half of volumes that Ukraine transited to Europe. At the same time, so the gas price was really high, even considering this discount prescribed by Kharkiv Pact. And the government started to look for solutions of importing gas from the European Union. So they started the first reverse gas flows from the EU. However, Russia was pressuring, trying to save its dominance and its monopoly over Ukraine's market. That was natural because well, in first 15 years, Ukraine was, of the independence, Ukraine was the biggest consumer of Russian gas in Europe. And so this market was huge, considering Russian exports. The next point was the Revolution of Dignity, when Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign a European Union Association Agreement, and that was a U-turn towards Russia, which finished with mass protests, and Yanukovych ran to Russia. And definitely this also impacted on Russia-Ukraine gas relations immediately. So Russia canceled this Kharkiv Pact and demanded extra high price for gas. It was 80% higher. And as Ukraine refused to pay this price, supplies were suspended. At the same time, Gazprom claimed $15 billion for pay because of this take-or-pay agreement, because they said that Ukraine had to pay for the volumes of gas that Ukraine didn't consume. So Ukrainian Naftogaz addressed to Stonewall arbitration against Gazprom, and later in 2018, actually Naftogaz won this arbitration, and so Gazprom, it was Gazprom who paid to Ukraine, which so there was almost $5 billion, which definitely was irritative for the Kremlin. And at that moment, it was clear that that Russia will not forget about this. So, however, at the time, so the next year, in late 2015, Ukraine refused from direct supplies from Russia and started buying gas in the European Union. That was reverse flows because Russian gas went through Ukraine to Europe, and these were direct supplies as well. And in some periods, this gas from Europe was cheaper than the gas that Russia proposed. At the same time, the war that Russia unleashed in Donbass created another problems for Ukrainian energy, because the only resource that Ukraine had enough, that Ukraine was self-sufficient, was coal. And the problem was that in Donbass, a specific type of coal, high-quality coal anthracite, that was produced only in Donbass. And about 20% of energy of steam coal consumed in Ukraine, that was anthracite. So at final extent, that has brought that Ukraine Ukraine had to import coal. And there were also supplies from Russia as well. And that was a basis for some corruptive schemes and making revenues for some people. And energy situation in late 2015, early 2015 was very difficult because of these coal shortages, because the risk of gas scarcity. And actually, at that moment, this gave a really serious impetus for Ukrainian government for strong reforms. However, in 2 years, when that was clear that situation was normalized, again, that was an issue of populism, because that is very hard to conduct reforms which sometimes are painful, and government is concerned about saving its popularity. So some reforms were slowing down. However, the progress that was achieved was still fundamental. So in 2015, Ukrainian parliament adopted a couple of laws changing design of energy markets. Later in 2017, that was about electricity market reform. Earlier, it was about gas market reform. That was about future integration of electricity power systems of Ukraine and Europe. So, however, despite of all this achieved progress, the problem was that some problems were not solved, and that was about market prices for energy for households. So that was the problem that wasn't solved during 31 years of independence. As I said, in 1981, there was no understanding in general. So now there was understanding, but there wasn't a political will to introduce market prices, because there was a fear of losing political popularity. So at the same time, so Europe's reflection was reflection for Crimea annexation was that actually European Union refused from South Stream pipeline, which was a pipeline that had to go under the Black Sea through Turkey, Bulgaria, and in Italy. There were some issues regarding recent European regulation, but and in early 2015, Europe adopted a new strategy which had to which actually was called to diversify energy supplies. But later, very soon, in September 2015, there was an agreement on the Nord Stream 2, and in a year, there was an agreement on Turk Stream. So Russia persuaded European states to build new pipelines bypassing Ukraine. During President Zelensky, what was agenda in the energy sector? So very strong point that was. So he was targeted to provide lower energy utility prices for households. That was again about this paternalism and populism. Energy imports from Russia were growing. However, so these were growing even before. So during 2015, 2020, we saw rising volumes of coal imports. And in 2019, we saw electricity imports from Russia. New transit contracts were signed. So there was 5-year gas and 10-year oil transit contract. Market was more imbalanced because of this desire to provide cheaper prices. So debts in energy markets were collecting, and there was so much overregulation. However, at the same time, there was an intention to have more cooperation with the United States, with US companies. So just to summarize the 30 years of energy policy. So as I said, that populism, paternalism, this lack of transparency, these were undermining energy modernization, and these, at some extent, these were deepening Ukraine's dependence on Russia. So there was lack of political will to conduct radical, quick, sometimes painful reforms, especially when it's about energy prices. There was a lack of long-term, transparent, and predictable energy policy. Overregulation and cross-subsidization badly affected on energy companies, and that was an obstacle for new investments in energy, especially when we are talking about foreign investments. And underinvestments that was caused by this populistic policy was an obstacle for energy modernization. And lack of modernization caused low energy efficiency. And non-market prices and not fair prices affected capability for energy efficiency enhancing and energy saving. And at the same time, this lack of transparency was contributing to rent seeking, especially when talking about oligarchs. And all these factors contributed to the problem that Ukraine failed to boost its gas production. So there were different plans and programs to make Ukraine self-sufficient, because as I said, Ukraine has the second biggest gas reserves in Europe, but still Ukraine is energy dependent on gas. And since the invasion, Ukraine-Russia energy relations has changed tremendously. On February 24, Ukrainian electricity power system was disconnected from Russian, and later, in a couple of weeks, it was connected to the European. Actually, this was a process which formally was started 5 years ago, but in reality, that was like 15 years process. And this could be possible, that was possible only because of these reforms started in 2015, and electricity market law voted in 2017 and implemented 2018. So, and now Ukraine was exporting electricity to Europe, to Moldova and European Union, helping to overcome the energy crisis that is the result of Russia's energy blackmailing. And so Ukraine completely banned energy imports from Russia. So coal, nuclear fuel. By the way, so diversification of nuclear fuel supplies started in 2014. However, that was a 15-year process of preparations to do this. Oil and petroleums imports from Russia and Belarus were also banned. And the problem was that there was only one refinery, big refinery, working in Ukraine, and this was destroyed with Russian air attacks. So Ukraine, in one moment, became dependent on petroleum imports from the European Union, and that was a 2 months long crisis. But the system was absolutely rebuilt, but still, so rebuilt with no supplies from Russia and Belarus. And companies from Russia and Belarus were banned to operate at energy market. Assets owned by these companies now are under procedures of nationalization. So the only deals that Ukraine has with Russia in energy, these are oil and gas transit deals. and Ukrainian energy infrastructure and reliable energy supply are facing the risk and the threat of Russian airstrikes. So I tried to do this very briefly in 40 minutes to tell the story of more than 30 years of relations with energy relations between Ukraine and Russia. Sure, I have missed a lot because it would take me 2 days to talk about this, but now I'm ready for Q&A session.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Prokip. That was so informative and fascinating. And I'm sure that our audience here will have questions. So I will start the discussion. My question is very brief while people are making up their minds. So this week, we've all learned about the missile strikes on the Ukrainian electric power plants that led to the electricity going off in 5 regions of Ukraine. So what will how long will it take to bring electricity back? Who will be the major players in the reconstruction of Ukraine's energy network? Will it be done by Ukrainian forces? Will European capital move in? What could you tell us? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. Sure, but I have one question in private that I have to ask you. That the question is, do you recognize so-called Donetsk People's Republic? No, I do not. Sure, I do not. So regarding these attacks on energy infrastructure, so actually Russia started doing this from the very beginning. In the very beginning, they were striking over fuel depots. So about 15 fuel depots were destroyed. Later, there was Kremenchuk oil refinery was destroyed, which contributed to fuel prices. But also there were attacks on electricity facilities. So these were a couple of cogeneration power plants were destroyed. Huge volume of generation capacities allocated within the territories which are occupied and non-controlled, and these do not operate. Some energy facilities are located close to the line of hostilities. These also do not operate. And also there is Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Maybe you have heard of this, which is under occupation, and this poses a risk of serious nuclear accident, which is an unique nuclear power plant because of many reasons, but this one is the biggest one in Europe. So Ukraine now has lost huge volume of power generation capacities. And at the same time, because of the war, energy demand has fallen. But so this attack that you mentioned that happened 2 days ago, this created some problems, but these were temporary because so power system is extremely sophisticated, and in the case of Ukrainian power system, which was a legacy of Soviet design. Which were designed to be very reliable. So there are mostly at least three additional lines to provide extra supply if anything happens. So this means that the power system has a strong huge level of reliability, but still air attacks pose a risk. So the question, who will be reconstructing? Yeah, that's a very good question. So now, so there was a conference in Lugano, Switzerland, in July that was about the reconstruction of Ukraine, and that was about donor funds. But this doesn't mean that Ukrainian power system and economy in general should be rebuilt in the same manner as it was. because for Ukraine, it's also an opportunity to rebuild, to make it more green. However, Ukrainian power system is very low carbon. So now about 87% of electricity is carbon zero. Because of nuclear power plants, because of big hydro, because of renewable facilities. However, so renewables, I mean, solar and wind were responsible for 13% of generation last year, but a huge part of those are now either destroyed or stolen or located within non-controlled territories, which is another one challenge.
Thank you very much. That's actually very reassuring. So we have several questions from the audience and a question from Jillian Porter. So if you allow me, I will ask, I will read a question from the audience and then I'll give the word to Jillian next. So our audience member named Jackson is asking, what is the popular opinion of this energy oligarchs? How much say do they have in energy policy?
These couple of these really did have serious market power. However, again, the war has changed. So the most prominent guy was Rinat Akhmetov. So he was a big player in electricity production. So if about quarter of electricity producing came from coal power plants, so he was a major player in coal, and he was also a very big player in renewables. He still owns 5 of the biggest distribution system operators. So he was the biggest. However, so the war has affected because some of his assets, so he lost these assets because some were destroyed, and most of those are located within non-controlled territories. Another energy oligarch who had a great power was Igor Kolomoisky. But he was owner of the biggest bank, private bank, which was nationalized in 2016, and so he's owner of private group who is a very important player in Ukrainian oil market. But Kremenchuk refinery, which he owned, was destroyed, for example. So the biggest producer of petrol in Ukraine. Another energy oligarch, Igor Firtash, who was co-owner of this Rosukrenergo company, which was related to Gazprom and was responsible for gas supplies to Ukraine between 2005-2009. So now he is under arrest in Vienna, and the United States are demanding, because actually he was arrested on the appeal of the United States. So he was owning about 20 gas distribution companies in Ukraine, which is about 75% of the market. But a couple of months ago, court has arrested this ownership, and now that is a question what's going to happen. But in most cases, oligarchs has lost a lot of their power, and looks like that these guys will not be so powerful when the war finishes. However, there is the question if we don't see occurrence of new oligarchs, because these guys who are oligarchs now, these are very old and very experienced. And earlier we saw examples when some oligarchs appeared, but these disappeared when there was reshuffle in government, where like during Yanukovych presidency. So definitely existing today oligarchs will lose their power, but will there occur new oligarchs or not? So that is a question.
Thank you very much. Jillian Porter, you had a question.
Thank you. I'll actually read one that's in the chat that was above Jackson's first, if that's okay. We have one from Caroline Ott, who said, if I understood this correctly, Ukraine has banned imports of fuel, coal, petroleum, etc., but has not banned contracts for transportation of fuel. Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so many people asked me this question in late February and early March, because at that moment there was no official explanation. And later, so my version was the same as official said later. So an official said that both in the case of gas transit and oil transit, Ukraine is ready to ban it, but as only as the European states who are dependent on this oil and gas transit say that they do not need this. And for example, in the case of oil transit, so 3 European states, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, are dependent on these pipeline supplies through Ukraine. And in the case of Hungary, it's about 90% of oil that country consumes. And so before, and another thing, so why government didn't want to do this, because there was a fear that if Ukraine bans this transit without negotiation with the European Union, that European Union could treat this as a blackmailing. So that's why now official position is that as only as Europe says that they do not need this transit, the next day government officially bans this. And so as you know today, so Russia, so previously Russia supplied about 40% of gas that European Union consumed. And there was a Ukrainian route, that was Yamal Europe, that was Nord Stream, Turk Stream. So Russia has banned Yamal Europe going through Belarus and Poland. Russia is not supplying gas through the Nord Stream. So the only are Ukrainian pipeline and Turk Stream, and in general, these supplies are 5 times less than normally it were like a year ago. So, well, that is an explanation, and that's not just an official explanation, but that's the real reason. So,
thank you. We have a question from Jeff Smith in the chat. Jeff is asking, has the Drusbah pipeline been damaged or disrupted during the war? How much product was flowing before February?
No, Drusbah pipeline wasn't affected despite of gas pipeline. If I'm not wrong, so before the war, it was 750 thousand barrels per day of crude that were transported to that 3 countries. So because in the case of gas pipeline, it was damaged, and some equipment located at the occupied territories. So Ukrainian, so despite the myth that the pipeline is very old, the reality is that it's in very good condition and with modern decisions, so it could be operated remotely from the dispatching center, and they see what's going on in any point of the pipeline. So they noticed an attempt of interference to this gas metering equipment. And there was a suspect that there was an attempt to steal gas to supply to one of the thermal power plants, actually in Luhansk, to produce electricity. So there was an issue with gas pipeline, but not with oil.
Thank you. And while we're waiting for more questions from the audience, I will ask a question. So is winter coming to Europe this winter? Will it look as frosted as Russian propaganda videos want us to think? And if not, are we to expect a degree of popular unrest in Europe that might damage the extent of support that Europe is lending to Ukraine right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really a very good question. So you never know what the winter will be. So last year we had a very warm winter, which actually helped to avoid the crisis. So this time it's so now it's a little bit colder than usually. So regarding the question, so the support, so that there was the most recent survey was conducted in July, and sorry, I just trying to find it. So it was about that. So about 87% of Europeans already are saving energy or are going to do this. And so number of share of population who are ready to withstand Russian undersupplies, so in order to continue support of Ukraine was also very high. And because the energy crisis that Russia tried to push in Europe, that wasn't the final aim, because the final aim was an attempt to provoke a political crisis, which will, because people are concerned with the gas prices and electricity prices, and governments are concerned about gas storages will be enough to pass the winter. And so, as it was expected in Kremlin, I believe that this concern of household concern would react on their unsatisfaction with government, and that would push some reshuffles. But now, government in all European states have developed the programs to support consumers. So it's about subsidies. It's about fixing prices. It's about supporting energy companies. So this probably has to soften the problem. So the statements that European Commission and many European states did, so that was the first, I would say that the first time I saw such a unity inside the European Union regarding Russian energy supplies, because when there was a discussion about the Nord Stream 2, the European Union was very splitted. And 1.5 months ago, there was meeting of European ministers on energy, and they actually agreed on the plan to reduce gas consumption in order to pass the winter in the case Russia suspends supplies. So the plan is about voluntary decrease of gas consumption for 15%, and actually all countries agreed. That was the only country which didn't agree was Hungary. That gives a good hope.
Thank you. We have one question from the audience, so I'll read it now, and then Jillian, maybe you could give us closing remarks. So the question is from Alexander Prosfiryakov, and he's asking, with the energy shortages and the abnormal prices in Europe, do you see the largest energy consuming industry players, metallurgy, heavy machinery, and so on, moving production from Europe to the United States?
It's a good question. So, but it's a good question. I know that the gas price in the United States is much lower than, it's almost 10 times lower than in the European Union. But I'm not sure that just 1 year or 1 winter is the time horizon to make such decisions. So I'm not sure it's time to think about moving productions to other states. So it's hard to answer.
Thank you, Jillian. Take it away.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great to get your summary of these decades of Russian-Ukrainian energy relations. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role that public attitudes have played in that history. To what extent have public attitudes, or cultural values of people in Ukraine had something to do with the way that different policies have been adopted or not? Is it the case that people who've been making decisions are engaged with public attitudes, or is it the case that the people who have been making these decisions, you know, that there's not really much room for public involvement in decision making? And so if you think about also the years ahead and maybe one or two changes that you would really like to see adopted with regard to energy so as to secure Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, you know, how do public attitudes or cultural values come into play when you think about the prospect of those changes coming into being or not?
It's a very good question. Thank you. Well, during the recent years, the role of civil society and public attitude sure was increasing. And ensure that when you have democracy, that political forces who are oriented to win elections, these are oriented to people's attitude. But also, not always you must have a majority in society, but you just have to react to some dominant part, most active part of the society. But as I mentioned, so that was a problem of paternalism. Which is attitude to the problem of what state should do and what people should do. So paternalism is still very high in the society, but sure, it's lower than we saw 30 years ago. The critical mass in society, the mass which push changes, there is already. So in some cases, that was public attitude and that was civil society who were pressuring governments to not to take some decisions. Actually, I like this theory much. It's of dominant social paradigm, which defines the worldview of some society, and it's actually the worldview of specific critical group of people. And there is the book I liked very much, published in 70s. Ark the Second, or Ark is this ship, and that was talking about dominant social paradigm and an attitude of people in different countries to different problems. And there was a very interesting example that that was about environmental problems. That people's attitude to environmental problems in United States and Soviet Union actually was very similar, but the problem was that in USA, there was democracy, and government had to react to that, what people see, to people's perception. And in Soviet Union, government didn't care, because government supposed that it has to plan and government knows better. But now, so government is reacting, and less paternalism, and more, there are more responsible people who are sure that they are responsible for their future, for the future of the country. So if we're talking about specific case of relations with Russia, or some trade with Russia, or pro-Russian politicians, so the war has changed this perception very seriously. So about 92 or 98% of population don't want to hear about some economic collaboration with Russia. And sure that the government will have to react to this, and sure that this will affect the pattern of the parliament in the next cohort. I mean, so Revolution of Dignity and Orange Revolution, they were demonstrating that civil society is strong, and that society in general is ready to pressure governments.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we'll conclude at that. Thank you so much, Dr. Prokip. That was terrific. And thank you, our audience, for asking excellent questions and staying with us. We do hope that you'll return for more of our series. We have really fascinating speakers lined up addressing the theme of energy from all angles, economy, environment, culture, and so on. So do come back, and thank you all. Have a good afternoon.